In just 1,463 days, four empires that had ruled half the world for centuries vanished, gone, erased from existence. The Ottoman Empire, 600 years of history obliterated. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved. The Russian Empire destroyed by its own people. The German Empire humiliated into non-existence. What you're about to discover is how one assassination, one bullet, in one forgotten corner of Europe, triggered a catastrophe so massive that it didn't just kill 20 million people, it killed the very idea of empire itself. This is the story of World War I, the war that ended empires. Picture the world in 1914. If you were standing in a European capital that summer, you would be living in what many believed was the peak of human civilization. The streets of Vienna buzzed with artists and intellectuals. The palaces of St. Petersburg glittered with unimaginable wealth. Berlin's factories hummed with industrial might. And in Istanbul, the Sultan still ruled over an empire that stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Vienna. Four great empires dominated this world. And here's what's staggering. These weren't just countries. These were massive, multi-ethnic, continent-spanning powers that had existed longer than the United States had been a nation. The Ottoman Empire had ruled for over 600 years. From the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans controlled the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe. In 1914, the Sultan still claimed dominion over 20 million people across 3 continents. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a patchwork of nations: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Croatians, Slovenians, Romanians, Italians, all ruled by the ancient Habsburg dynasty from their palace in Vienna. The Emperor Franz Joseph had been on the throne since 1848. Think about that. He'd been emperor longer than most people had been alive. The Russian Empire was the largest country on earth. The Tsar ruled over 1/6 of the world's land surface, over 180 million subjects. From the frozen tundra of Siberia to the warm waters of the Black Sea, the Romanov dynasty had controlled Russia for 300 years. And the German Empire, the new kid on the block, unified only in 1871, but already the most powerful industrial and military force in Europe. Kaiser Wilhelm II commanded the mightiest army the world had ever seen. These 4 empires seemed permanent, unshakable, eternal. They were wrong. But beneath the surface of glittering palaces and military parades, Europe in 1914 was a powder keg waiting to explode. Here's what most people don't understand about World War I. It wasn't started by one clear villain with one evil plan. It was something far more dangerous. A system so unstable that one wrong move would trigger total catastrophe. Europe had divided itself into 2 armed camps. On one side, Germany and Austria, Hungary linked by a military alliance. On the other side, France and Russia, also bound by treaty. And hovering over everything was the British Empire, the global superpower trying to maintain the balance. Each empire had reasons to fear the others. Germany felt encircled by France and Russia. Austria-Hungary was terrified of nationalism tearing apart its multi-ethnic empire. Russia saw itself as the protector of Slavic peoples. The Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe, losing territory and desperate to survive. And they'd already come close to war, multiple times. The Moroccan crises, the Balkan Wars, each time Europe stepped back from the brink. But everyone knew the next crisis might be different. June 28, 1914, Sarajevo, Bosnia. A sunny Sunday morning. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was visiting this recently annexed province with his wife Sophie. It was their wedding anniversary. They rode through the streets in an open-top car waving to crowds. The Archduke wasn't particularly popular in Vienna. He was considered a reformer, dangerously so. He wanted to give more rights to the Slavic peoples within the empire. This terrified the hardliners who believed any concession would destroy Austria-Hungary. But it also terrified Serbian nationalists who wanted Bosnia to break away and join Serbia. To them, Franz Ferdinand was the symbol of Austrian oppression. Among the crowd that day was a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip. He was tubercular, frail, and he was carrying a Belgian-made FN model 1910 pistol. Princip was part of a conspiracy, a secret society called the Black Hand, trained and equipped by elements within Serbian military intelligence. There were 7 assassins positioned along the route that day. The first attempt failed. A bomb was thrown at the Archduke's car, but Franz Ferdinand saw it coming and deflected it with his arm. It exploded under the car behind them, wounding several people. The Archduke was furious, but insisted on continuing to the hospital to visit the wounded. A simple decision, a fatal decision. But here's the twist of fate that changed history. The driver took a wrong turn. Realizing his mistake, the driver stopped the car to reverse, directly in front of a delicatessen, where Gavrilo Princip happened to be standing. Princip couldn't believe his luck. The target he'd thought he'd missed was now 5 feet away. He stepped forward, raised his pistol, and fired twice. One bullet hit Sophie in the abdomen. The other struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. Sophie died almost instantly. Franz Ferdinand, bleeding out in his wife's lap, whispered his last words. "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." He died minutes later, 2 people, 2 bullets, and the world would never be the same. What happened next is called the July Crisis, and it's one of the most tragic examples of diplomatic failure in human history. Austria-Hungary wanted revenge, but not just on the assassins, on Serbia itself. They believed, correctly, that Serbian intelligence had helped plan the assassination. On July 23rd, Austria sent Serbia an ultimatum with 10 demands so harsh that they were designed to be rejected. Serbia accepted 9 of them, but Austria said that wasn't good enough. And here's where the alliance system became a suicide pact. Austria declared war on Serbia. Russia, protector of the Slavs, began mobilizing to defend Serbia. Germany, allied with Austria, demanded Russia stop mobilizing. When Russia refused, Germany declared war on Russia. France, allied with Russia, began mobilizing. Germany declared war on France. To attack France quickly, Germany invaded neutral Belgium. Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality, so Britain declared war on Germany. In just 6 days, from July 28th to August 4th, all of Europe's great powers were at war. And here's what's heartbreaking. Millions of people cheered. They thought it would be a great adventure. Home before the leaves fall, they said, over by Christmas. In every capital, young men rushed to enlist, terrified they might miss the excitement. Poets wrote verses celebrating the cleansing power of war. Intellectuals proclaimed this would be the war to end all wars, that would settle Europe's problems once and for all. They had no idea they were marching into hell. The first months of the war were movement and manoeuvre, armies sweeping across Belgium and France, just like in the old days. But then something unprecedented happened. The weapons had changed, but the tactics hadn't caught up. Machine guns could fire 600 rounds per minute. Artillery shells could be fired with mathematical precision from miles away. Barbed wire created impassable barriers. By November 1914, the Western Front had frozen into a line of trenches stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border. 450 miles of mud, barbed wire, and death. And this wasn't just a line of trenches. This was a complex system. Frontline trenches, support trenches, reserve trenches, communication trenches, underground dugouts, machine gun nests, artillery positions. Soldiers lived in these trenches for weeks, sometimes months, in the mud, with the rats, with the corpses of their friends rotting in no man's land because it was too dangerous to retrieve them. They suffered from trench foot, flesh literally rotting off their bones from constant wet. They endured artillery barrages that lasted for days, shells screaming overhead every second, the ground shaking like an earthquake. And when the order came to attack, to go over the top, they climbed out of their trenches and walked toward enemy machine guns across open ground. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day. The first day. 20,000 dead in a single morning. And for what? At the end of the 5-month battle, the Allies had advanced 6 miles. Then came poison gas, chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas, men choking, drowning in their own fluids, blinded, lungs seared. The empires had created an industrial slaughter machine, and they were feeding their best and brightest young men into it. But while the Western Front gets most of the attention, World War I was truly a world war. And that's where our 4 empires began to crack. On the Eastern Front, German and Austro-Hungarian forces battled the Russian Empire across vast distances. Millions of men died in battles most people have never heard of. Tannenberg, the Masurian Lakes, the Brusilov offensive. Russia was bleeding. By 1917, the Russian army had suffered nearly 2 million dead and 5 million wounded. Food shortages gripped the cities. The Tsar's government was collapsing. The Ottoman Empire fought on multiple fronts. Gallipoli, where they heroically defeated a British invasion. Mesopotamia, where they initially crushed British forces at Kut, and the vast deserts of Arabia, where revolt was brewing. A British officer named T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, was organising Arab tribes to rebel against their Ottoman masters. The 600-year-old empire was being torn apart from within. Austria-Hungary was struggling. Their armies were a patchwork of ethnicities, many with no desire to die for Vienna. Czech soldiers surrendered en masse to the Russians. South Slavs deserted. The Empire's army was disintegrating even as it fought, and Germany, mighty Germany, was being strangled by the British naval blockade. By 1917, Germans were starving. The turnip winter of 1916–17 saw people eating animal feed to survive. The empires were breaking, not from one dramatic defeat, but from exhaustion, from hunger, from the realization that this war wasn't going to end, that millions were dead for, what? A few miles of cratered mud? The Ottoman Empire was starving. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was fracturing. The Russian Empire was on the verge of revolution. The German Empire was collapsing from within. And in 1917, everything that could go wrong for the empires did. In Part 2, you'll discover how the Russian Empire became the first to fall, torn apart by revolution and civil war. How America's entry into the war shifted the balance, and how, in the span of just a few months in 1918, all 4 empires would simultaneously collapse in the most dramatic political transformation in modern history.
In Part 1, we watched 4 empires march confidently into what they thought would be a short, glorious war. By 1917, those same empires were on their knees, bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Now, you're about to witness something that had never happened before in human history: the simultaneous collapse of multiple superpowers in the span of just 12 months. And here's what most history books won't tell you. These empires didn't just lose the war. They destroyed themselves from within. Let's see how. February 1917, Petrograd, Russia. It's minus 20 degrees and there's no bread. Women have been standing in bread lines for hours in the freezing cold. For the 3rd day in a row, they're being told there's nothing left. These aren't revolutionaries. They're mothers trying to feed their children, housewives, factory workers. And on February 23rd, International Women's Day, they'd had enough. They poured into the streets, thousands of them. Then tens of thousands. "Bread! Bread! Bread!" they chanted. The Tsar's police tried to disperse them. The women refused to leave. The next day, factory workers joined them, then students. Then soldiers began defecting, bringing their rifles with them. Within 5 days, 500,000 people filled the streets of Petrograd. Tsar Nicholas II, the man who ruled 1/6 of the Earth's surface, the descendant of a dynasty that had ruled Russia for 300 years, ordered his troops to fire on the crowds. But here's what changed everything. The soldiers refused. Not just a few, entire regiments mutinied. They turned their guns on their officers and joined the revolution. Nicholas didn't understand what was happening. He was at military headquarters, hundreds of miles away, still thinking he could crush this like any other uprising. His generals came to him on March 15th with devastating news. The army would no longer follow his orders. The war had destroyed his military's loyalty. 3 years of sending men to die in frozen trenches for incompetent generals. 3 years of watching their families starve while aristocrats lived in palaces. The soldiers had finally said no. Nicholas II abdicated. 300 years of Romanov rule ended with a signature on a piece of paper. The Russian Empire was finished. But here's the terrifying part. What came next was even worse. A provisional government tried to keep Russia in the war. Fatal mistake. The Russian people didn't want reform. They wanted out of the war. They wanted bread. They wanted land. And there was one man who promised all three: Vladimir Lenin. Lenin had been living in exile in Switzerland. The Germans, seeing an opportunity to knock Russia out of the war completely, sealed Lenin in a railway car and sent him back to Russia like a human weapon. And he was. Lenin and his Bolsheviks promised peace, land, bread. In November 1917, they seized power in a second revolution. Russia descended into civil war. The Reds versus the Whites. Communists versus everyone else. For 3 years, Russia tore itself apart. Millions died, from fighting, from starvation, from disease. The Bolsheviks won, but the Russia that emerged was fundamentally different. The first communist state in history. And here's the connection to today that everyone misses. That revolution didn't just change Russia, it created an ideological split that dominated global politics for the next 70 years. The Cold War, the Korean War, Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Cuban Missile Crisis, all of it traces back to this moment in 1917, when the Russian Empire collapsed and became the Soviet Union. But while Russia was imploding, something else happened that would change the war completely. April 6, 1917. The United States declared war on Germany. After 3 years of neutrality, America was in. And this wasn't just any country entering the war. This was the richest, most industrialized nation on Earth, untouched by war, with a population of 100 million. The Germans knew exactly what this meant. They had a few months, maybe a year, before millions of fresh American troops would arrive in France. So they made a desperate gamble. In March 1918, Germany launched 5 massive offensives on the Western Front: Operation Michael, Georgette, Blücher York, Gneisenau, and Marneschutz Rams. These weren't careful strategic attacks. This was Germany throwing everything it had at the Allies, trying to win before America's full strength could be brought to bear. And at first, it worked. The German army broke through Allied lines. For the first time since 1914, the war of movement had returned. German troops advanced 40 miles in some sectors. Paris was within range of German artillery. People in Paris could hear the guns. The city began to evacuate. It looked like Germany might actually win. But here's what Germany had forgotten. They were starving. The British naval blockade had been strangling Germany for 4 years. German soldiers advancing across France were literally stopping to eat food they found in captured Allied positions because they were so hungry. They called it the turnip offensive, because that's all they'd been eating for months. By July 1918, the offensive had stalled. Germany had shot its last bolt. And now, American troops were arriving at the rate of 10,000 per day. Fresh, well-fed, equipped with unlimited supplies. The balance had shifted irreversibly. August 8, 1918. The Allies counterattacked. The German General Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German army. German soldiers, exhausted and starving, began surrendering en masse. Entire divisions simply gave up. The German army was disintegrating. But the real collapse was happening at home. In Germany, people were starving. The 1918 flu pandemic was killing hundreds of thousands, and German sailors, ordered to conduct one final suicidal naval attack against the British fleet, mutinied. The Kiel mutiny spread like wildfire. Workers' and soldiers' councils formed across Germany, just like in Russia. Kaiser Wilhelm II saw what had happened to Tsar Nicholas. He fled to Holland on November 10, 1918. The next day, Germany signed the armistice. The German Empire was finished. What had taken Bismarck decades to build, what had seemed like it would last forever, collapsed in weeks. Now let's go to Austria-Hungary, because what happened there reveals something crucial about why empires actually fall. The Austro-Hungarian Empire wasn't defeated by enemy armies, it defeated itself. Remember, this was an empire of a dozen different nationalities forced together under Habsburg rule. Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Italians, all of them wanting independence. For years, the war had held them together through sheer force and propaganda. But by 1918, the subject peoples had had enough. Czech and Slovak leaders declared independence in October. The South Slavs, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, announced they were forming their own state, Yugoslavia. The Romanians in Transylvania voted to join Romania. The Italians in the border regions joined Italy. The Poles declared an independent Poland. Emperor Karl I, who had inherited the throne in 1916, when Franz Josef finally died after 68 years of rule, watched helplessly as his empire simply dissolved. There was no dramatic final battle. The empire just stopped existing. Different peoples went their separate ways. On November 11, 1918, the same day Germany surrendered, Karl renounced his participation in government. He didn't formally abdicate because he still hoped he might somehow return. He never did. The Habsburg Empire, which had ruled Central Europe since the 1200s, vanished. And here's what's crucial. It didn't fall because of military defeat. It fell because people no longer believed in it. Nationalism had killed imperialism. Now, the Ottoman Empire. This is the most tragic and complex collapse of them all, and its consequences are still killing people today. The Ottoman Empire in 1918 was fighting on 4 fronts simultaneously. British and Arab forces under Lawrence of Arabia had seized Damascus and Aleppo. British troops from Egypt had conquered Palestine and were pushing into Syria. British and Indian forces had taken Baghdad and were advancing through Mesopotamia. And in the Caucasus, the Ottomans were fighting the Russians until Russia's collapse. When the armistice was signed on October 30, 1918, the Ottoman Empire was finished as a military force. But it still existed as a political entity. The Sultan was still in Constantinople. Allied troops occupied the capital, but the empire technically survived. What happened next changed the Middle East forever. The Allies, particularly Britain and France, had made contradictory promises during the war. They'd promised the Arabs independence if they revolted against the Ottomans. They'd promised the Jews a homeland in Palestine through the Balfour Declaration. And they'd secretly agreed between themselves to divide the Middle East into spheres of influence through the Sykes-Picot Agreement. All three promises couldn't be kept, and they weren't. The Arabs felt betrayed. The stage was set for a century of Middle East conflict that continues today. Every time you hear about Israel-Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, you're seeing the consequences of how the Ottoman Empire was carved up. But here's what most people don't know. The Ottoman Empire didn't just dissolve peacefully like Austria-Hungary. A Turkish general named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, refused to accept the harsh peace terms the Allies imposed. He organized a resistance movement. The Turkish War of Independence lasted from 1919 to 1923. Kemal defeated Greek armies that had invaded Anatolia, negotiated a new treaty that was far more favorable, and abolished the Ottoman Sultanate entirely. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, fled Constantinople on a British warship in November 1922. 6 centuries of Ottoman rule ended not with glory, but with a sultan sneaking out of his own capital in the middle of the night. Turkey survived, but as a completely different country. A secular republic, not a religious empire. The caliphate was abolished. Turkey turned its back on its imperial past and tried to become a Western nation. But the rest of the Ottoman Empire became the modern Middle East, a patchwork of artificial states created by European colonial powers, with borders drawn by British and French diplomats who often had never visited the regions they were dividing. Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan. These weren't ancient nations. They were inventions of the post-World War I settlement, and many of them have never really worked as stable countries. So, in the span of 12 months, from November 1917 to November 1918, all 4 empires collapsed. Russia fell to revolution and civil war. Germany fell to military defeat and revolution. Austria-Hungary simply dissolved into its component nationalities. The Ottoman Empire was partitioned and its heartland transformed. Think about the scale of this transformation. 4 empires that had ruled more than half of humanity. Dynasties that had lasted centuries. The Romanovs, 300 years. The Habsburgs, over 600 years. The Ottomans, over 600 years. The Hohenzollerns, nearly 500 years if you count their history before German unification. All gone in 1 year. Nothing like this had ever happened before. And here's the question we need to ask. Why? What made 1918 different from every other year in history? Why did empires that had survived wars, plagues, and revolutions for centuries all collapse simultaneously? The answer is, World War I revealed a fundamental truth. Traditional empires couldn't survive modern total war. Total war required total mobilization of society. Every factory, every farm, every worker, every woman and child had to contribute to the war effort. And when you mobilize an entire society for war, you can't keep them politically powerless. The empires promised their people sacrifice now, victory later. But victory never came. Just more death, more starvation, more suffering. And when the people realized their emperors had no answers, that their sacrifice was for nothing, they stopped obeying. In Part 3, you'll discover what rose from the ashes of these empires, how the flawed peace created at Versailles planted the seeds for an even more terrible war just 20 years later, how the borders drawn in 1919 are still causing conflicts today, and, most importantly, what lessons we should learn from the fall of these empires. Lessons that are terrifyingly relevant right now. Because here's the truth. The people in 1914 thought their empires were eternal too. They were wrong. Are we making the same mistake today?
January 18th, 1919, the Palace of Versailles, France. The same palace where the German Empire had been triumphantly proclaimed in 1871 after defeating France. Now the tables had turned. Representatives from 32 nations gathered in the Hall of Mirrors to decide the fate of the world. The empires were dead. The question was, what would replace them? What happened in that palace over the next 6 months didn't create peace. It created a 20-year ceasefire. And the men making these decisions had no idea they were planting the seeds for something even worse than the war they'd just survived. Let me show you how the victors won the war, but lost the peace, and why we're still living with the consequences today. The Paris Peace Conference was dominated by 4 men. Woodrow Wilson, the American president who believed he could redesign the world based on high-minded principles. Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister who wanted Germany crushed so thoroughly it could never threaten France again. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister trying to balance revenge with practicality. And Vittorio Orlando of Italy, angry that his country wasn't getting the territorial rewards it had been promised. Germany wasn't invited to negotiate. Neither was Russia, now communist and terrifying to the Western powers. The defeated empires had no voice. The victors would dictate terms. And here's where everything went wrong. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination in Sarajevo, wasn't a peace treaty. It was a punishment document. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war under Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. Think about that. A war that involved dozens of countries, that grew from a complex tangle of alliances and miscalculations, was blamed entirely on one nation. The Germans were forced to sign, but they never accepted it. From day one, every German political party, from far left to far right, called Versailles a dictated peace, a diktat. The treaty became the most hated document in German history. But it got worse. Germany was ordered to pay reparations so massive that economists at the conference warned it would cripple the German economy for generations. 132 billion gold marks, roughly 442 billion in today's money. Germany's entire industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley, was occupied by French troops to ensure compliance. The German army was limited to 100,000 men. No tanks, no air force, no submarines. The German navy was scuttled by its own crews rather than be handed over. Germany lost 13% of its European territory and all of its overseas colonies. 7 million Germans suddenly found themselves living in other countries: Poland, Czechoslovakia, France. Here's what the peacemakers didn't understand. You can't humiliate a nation of 65 million educated, industrialized people and expect them to accept it peacefully, especially when many Germans felt they hadn't actually lost the war militarily. The German army had retreated, yes, but it had never been defeated on German soil. No Allied soldiers had marched through Berlin. So when the treaty arrived with its harsh terms, many Germans believed they'd been betrayed, the famous stab-in-the-back myth. They blamed democratic politicians, Jews, communists, anyone but their own military leadership. The Weimar Republic, Germany's first democracy, was born under this cloud of resentment. And from day one, extremists on both left and right sought to destroy it. The communists tried to seize power. Right-wing paramilitary groups, filled with embittered war veterans, murdered politicians they considered traitors. The government was so weak it couldn't even control its own streets. In 1923, hyperinflation destroyed the German economy. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. People's life savings became worthless overnight. The middle class was wiped out. And in that chaos, a failed artist and war veteran named Adolf Hitler attempted his first grab for power in Munich. He failed in 1923. But the conditions that would eventually bring him to power in 1933, economic chaos, national humiliation, political instability, and burning resentment over Versailles, all of those were created by the peace settlement of 1919. Now let's look at what happened to the territories of the dead empires, because this is where the map of the modern world was literally drawn, often with devastating consequences that last to this day. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was carved into 7 different countries. Austria and Hungary became small, separate nations. Czechoslovakia was created, jamming Czechs and Slovaks together into one country despite their different histories and desires. Yugoslavia was invented, forcing Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosnians, Macedonians, and Montenegrins into a single state. Poland was resurrected after 123 years of not existing, carved from German, Austrian, and Russian territory. Do you see the pattern? The peacemakers created multi-ethnic states in the name of national self-determination. The contradiction was staggering. These new countries had the same problem that had destroyed Austria-Hungary: different peoples with different languages, religions, and national aspirations forced to live together. And it got worse. Millions of people found themselves on the wrong side of new borders. Germans in Czechoslovakia and Poland, Hungarians in Romania and Czechoslovakia. The stage was set for ethnic tensions that would explode repeatedly throughout the 20th century. Yugoslavia collapsed in the 1990s in a series of wars so brutal that Europe saw concentration camps again, 50 years after the Holocaust. Czechoslovakia peacefully split in 1993. These weren't ancient ethnic hatreds. They were the consequences of borders drawn badly in 1919. But nowhere were the consequences more severe and more lasting than in the former Ottoman Empire. Britain and France carved up the Middle East like it was a cake at a birthday party. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, that secret deal they'd made during the war, became the basis for the new map. France got Syria and Lebanon. Britain got Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan as mandates, colonies in all but name. Let's focus on what Britain did in the Middle East, because this is where so many of today's conflicts were born. Iraq was created by jamming 3 Ottoman provinces together: Mosul in the north, with its Kurdish population and oil; Baghdad in the center, with its Sunni Arab population; and Basra in the south, with its Shia Arab population. 3 groups that had never been one country. 3 groups with different religious and ethnic identities. The British installed a Hashemite king from Arabia who had no connection to Iraq. They drew the borders to ensure British access to oil. Does this sound familiar? When Iraq exploded after the 2003 American invasion, when ISIS emerged in the Sunni areas, when Kurds sought independence, all of that traces back to how Britain created Iraq in 1920-1921. Syria and Lebanon were artificial French creations. The French actually carved Lebanon out of Syria specifically to create a Christian majority state, setting up the sectarian tensions that led to Lebanon's civil war in the 1970s and continue today. And then there's Palestine. Oh, Palestine. During the war, Britain made 3 incompatible promises. They promised the Arabs independence through the Hussein McMahon correspondence. They promised the Jews a national home in Palestine through the Balfour Declaration of 1917. And they promised the French they'd share control of the region through Sykes-Picot. All 3 couldn't be honoured. Britain took control of Palestine as a mandate and tried to manage the impossible situation they'd created: Arab Palestinians who'd lived there for centuries, and Jewish immigrants arriving in increasing numbers, especially as persecution intensified in Europe. The British never figured it out. In 1947, they gave up and handed the problem to the United Nations, which partitioned Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. The result was immediate war, and that war has never really ended. Every Israeli-Palestinian conflict, every Gaza war, every settlement dispute, every Jerusalem crisis, it all goes back to the contradictory promises Britain made during World War I and the way the Ottoman Empire was partitioned. Today, in 2025, we're still dealing with these consequences. Syria's civil war, Iraq's instability, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Kurdish struggles for independence, Lebanese political crisis. These aren't ancient hatreds. These are the direct results of how the Ottoman Empire was carved up over 100 years ago. But here's the biggest question, and this is why this history matters right now. What can we learn from the fall of these four empires? First lesson, no empire is permanent. The Ottoman sultans, the Habsburg emperors, the Russian Tsars, the German Kaisers, all of them believed their empires would last forever. They had ruled for centuries. They commanded vast armies. They controlled enormous wealth. And in less than 5 years, all of them were gone. Look at today's superpowers, America, which has dominated global affairs since 1945. China, rising rapidly to challenge American supremacy. Russia, trying to reclaim its imperial greatness. Do these powers look stable to you? America is deeply divided politically. China faces demographic collapse and economic challenges. Russia is pouring its resources into a war in Ukraine that's bleeding it dry. The lesson of 1918 is that empires that seem eternal can collapse with stunning speed when the right combination of factors align. Military defeat, economic crisis, loss of legitimacy, and the refusal of subject peoples to continue obeying. Second lesson, bad peace treaties create future wars. The Treaty of Versailles humiliated Germany without actually weakening it permanently. It was harsh enough to create burning resentment, but not harsh enough to prevent Germany from eventually recovering and seeking revenge. 20 years later, World War II killed 75 million people, 3 times as many as World War I. Think about that when you hear about peace negotiations today, whether it's Ukraine and Russia, Israel and Palestine, or any other conflict. How the peace is made matters as much as winning the war. A peace that humiliates creates the seeds of future conflict. Third lesson, artificial states created by great powers rarely work. Iraq, Syria, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia. These weren't organic nations. They were inventions of diplomats drawing lines on maps, and most of them have either collapsed or suffered terrible internal conflicts. Today, we see the same pattern. Western powers trying to export democracy to societies not ready for it. Borders that make no sense ethnically or culturally. States that exist on maps, but not in the hearts of their people. The lesson of 1919 is clear. You can't impose political solutions that ignore ethnic, religious, and cultural realities. Eventually, those artificial structures collapse. Fourth lesson, modern war destroys the societies that wage it, even the victors. Britain and France won World War I, but the victory broke them. Britain lost nearly 1 million men, the best of a generation. The economic cost was staggering. The British Empire began its decline, and by 1947 India was independent. France was bled white. Russia descended into communist dictatorship and civil war that killed millions. Germany and Austria became political and economic disasters. Everyone lost. Even the countries that won on paper were shattered by the experience. And this is the most important lesson for today. In the age of modern warfare, there are no real winners, only survivors. So here we are in 2025, living in a world still shaped by the collapse of empires over a century ago. The Middle East is still unstable because of how the Ottoman Empire was partitioned. Europe's politics are still influenced by the borders drawn in 1919. Russia's aggression in Ukraine is partly driven by resentment over lost imperial territory. China looks at its century of humiliation at Western hands and vows never to be weak again. The empires are gone, but their ghosts still haunt us. And here's the warning: we might be watching new empires approach their breaking points. When the Russian Empire collapsed, no one expected it until it happened. When the German Empire fell, it seemed impossible just months before. When Austro-Hungary dissolved, people were shocked at how quickly it happened. When the Ottoman Empire was partitioned, few imagined the consequences would still be killing people a century later. Empires always think they're different, that they're stronger, that they've learned from history. But history shows us that pride comes before the fall, that internal rot often matters more than external threats, that people will only accept authoritarian rule as long as it delivers peace and prosperity. And when it fails, the collapse can be sudden and total. The war that ended empires taught us that the mighty can fall, that bad peace creates future war, that artificial states fail, and that modern war destroys everyone who participates in it. The question is, have we learned these lessons, or are we doomed to repeat them? If this video opened your eyes to how World War I still shapes our world today, do 3 things right now. First, hit subscribe. This channel uncovers the historical truths that explain today's world, connections mainstream media ignores. Second, smash that notification bell so you don't miss the next video. Third, share this with someone who needs to understand why the Middle East is always in conflict, or why today's superpowers might be heading for the same collapse. Drop a comment. Do you think we're ignoring the same warning signs that destroyed the empires of 1918? I read every comment. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And right now, in 2025, we're seeing dangerous echoes of 1914, great powers facing off, nationalism rising, economic instability spreading, empires fall, always. Don't let history repeat itself while you watch from the sidelines. Stay curious, stay informed, and remember, this is history that matters. This is your world. Until next time.